Okay, welcome everyone. Hello. My name is Mia, and I'm a member of the Robbinsdale for Racial Justice group, and I'm a resident in Ward 3 near Lee Park. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I especially want to thank Jason Greenberg, our Robbinsdale City Council Ward 2 candidate, for speaking with us today. The intention of this meeting is to allow for a space to talk about racial justice and equity issues as they pertain to our elected officials ahead of our primary election coming up on August 11th. Several members of the Robbinsdale for Racial Justice group have come up with a series of questions, and I have presented these questions to the candidate a couple of days ago. So we are here to listen and become better informed voters. And for those of us who are white members of the community, we are here to be better allies to our neighbors who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. With that said, we will allow space for follow-up questions from the audience at the end, and white people will defer and listen to BIPOC members when they have something to say. This meeting is recorded, as you should be able to see a recording icon on your screen. And you'll notice that audience microphones are off for the first part of our meeting. And then you'll be invited to ask follow-up questions via the chat later on. And I will open your microphone if you prefer. So the meeting structure will be as follows. In a moment, Mr. Greenberg will have 5 minutes for an introduction and opening statements. Then I will spend about 30 minutes asking the questions that we as a group voted on. And then we will take questions from you in the chat for 15 minutes. And then finally, Jason will have 2 minutes for any closing statements where we will wrap up the meeting. Okay, so Jason, thank you so much for being here. Will you please introduce yourself and give us your opening statement?
Yeah, thanks Mia, and thanks to the group for having me. My name is Jason Greenberg, and I've lived in Robbinsdale for 13 years. My wife and I have 2 daughters, age 13 and 10. They both have attended, or well, one is currently attending Lakeview Elementary School, but they both have attended Lakeview, and one is attending Robbinsdale Middle School currently. And I'm running to be the city council member to represent the voices of Ward 2. So some of my experience, I've served as the at-large member of the Robbinsdale Planning Commission for the past, well, almost 8 years. And I've been a Robbinsdale representative on the Blue Line Extension Community Advisory Committee. And also done a lot of volunteering at school events and even did some teaching of students for the Junior Achievement Program last year at Lakeview. So in my professional career, I've been an account executive, a sales engineer for a lot of different technology companies around the area. And then the other part of my career was spent in the music business. So I worked with artists and record labels and radio stations. And then in my time on the Planning Commission, I've worked to recommend policies that positively impact Robbinsdale residents. So we talk a lot about conditional use permits and variances to helping with the comprehensive plan. And I've really tried to represent the voice of all Robbinsdale residents and do what's best for our city. So I'm speaking with you guys today. Well, I'm speaking with the Robbinsdale for Racial Justice group today because I believe in engaging the community and sharing my ideas and also hearing the viewpoints of our residents. So throughout my life, I've worked to be an ally and tried to be an advocate for people who feel their voices aren't heard. The killing of George Floyd was a wake-up call that spurred the creation of this group. And as someone who has spent a lot of time learning history and studying history, I have been educated about social justice issues. However, over the last few months, I've tried to listen more and read and watch and educate myself more about people who are having experiences that are different from my own. So I know I'm going to do a lot of talking today, And I can tell you right now, I'm not going to have every answer, but I am open to hearing people's ideas, and I feel that we can connect. The more that we can connect our communities within Robbinsdale, the better our city will be.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So for the next part of our meeting, we will be asking you a series of questions that the group has submitted and organized in advance. And for transparency's sake, these questions were presented to Jason a few days ago. And by the way, any other candidate that's also meeting with this group in other Zoom calls, these same questions will be asked in the same order. So I'll refrain from asking any follow-up questions at this time. But Jason, if you see any activity in the chat box, which is open to the group, if you want to address that in real time, please feel free. And also, if it's okay, for any answers that exceed maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I may kindly just say 15 seconds to ask you to summarize and wrap up so we can get to as many questions as possible today. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, great. So let's jump right in with our first question. What are some of the racial inequities that you identify in Robbinsdale? And what are the metrics you would use to measure our progress in those areas?
Sure. So one specific one is just around covenants. And I know there's been a lot of education going on around those. There are laws in place that invalidate those covenants. However, I know that just the language being associated with a deed can be really hurtful for people and make people feel excluded. And so I know there's been some progress as far as the Robbinsdale City Council, educating people more. But that's definitely one area where I see racial injustice in Robbinsdale. One other thing that I would point out, just as a larger context and in reading and learning, I read an article in the Washington Post that was talking about the Twin Cities and a lot of the progressive policies that have been in place. And I know this doesn't specifically apply to Robbinsdale, but in the Twin Cities, the NAACP had shared that a typical Black family earned just under $40,000 on average in 2017, while the typical white family had an income of a little bit over $82,000. For Black families, that's lower than the national average. And for white families, that's actually much higher than the national average. And so if anyone is concerned, I know maybe not so much in this group, but anyone that might watch this afterwards, if anyone is concerned that there isn't an issue of racial inequity within the Twin Cities, I think that puts a pretty fine point that we do have issues that we need to address.
Excellent, thank you. My next question, what strategies will you use to increase racial equity in Robbinsdale if you're elected?
So, I mean, my number one area of focus is really about community connections and working to make sure that specifically within Ward 2, but Robbinsdale as a whole, feels that our communities are more connected. And I feel really strongly that not only from a city council standpoint of getting information out to people and making sure that people's voices are heard, but even within our neighborhoods, making people feel more connected, expanding. I mean, I think Robbinsdale is unique in that neighbors know one another really well and tend to take care of one another, or at least look out for one another. And I know that that's not the experience across the board, but in general, that's something that I think makes Robbinsdale special. And so we just need to do a better job of expanding those networks and making sure that people know their neighbors, but just more than just, beyond their block, that it goes, within their neighborhood. And I think, that is one really large way of involving the community. The other piece would just be around transparency and making sure that people's voices are heard, and that if there are issues that we're sharing as much information as we can.
Great, thank you. Now, my next question, you mentioned a little bit in your introduction, but I'll ask you anyhow. So have you done any personal work or learning on topics of racism? And if so, what nature?
Yeah, so I'm involved with employee resource groups at work. I've been through implicit bias training. I'm currently in a cohort that is working around allyship training and understanding what that means and being a leader and things like that around racial equity. But I've also been, like I said, I've been reading and listening. So podcasts like 1619, Bobby Kennedy for President. I listen to a lot of a show on NPR called Hidden Brain. That's really good. It talks a lot about like our biases and like what our brains are doing and thinking. In the Bubble is another podcast, and reading around, you know, how to be anti-racist. So yeah, definitely have been trying to to learn and listen.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Next question is about the Robbinsdale Police Department. So how would you hold the RPD accountable if there were inappropriate or harmful actions?
Yeah, so again, kind of going back to the community and making sure voices are heard. So I think just making sure, in as much as we can, I know there's a lot of regulations around things you can and can't say, whether from a personnel area or just someone's personal rights. But that said, if there is a problem, if there's something that happens, making sure that the people that feel like they were treated unfairly or that something bad happened, that that voice is amplified, that they can communicate in whatever way they need to and representing that voice. And then again, I think in as much as is possible to be transparent with information, you know, that of what happened. And again, I know there's like certain rules, but at the same time, I think just trying to be as transparent as possible.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what policy changes have you contributed to in support of racial justice and equity?
So I'm on the Planning Commission. I don't know that we've put like specific policies in place, but just around, you know, the comprehensive plan and ideas for, you know, what our zoning districts look like, where we envision that there could be redevelopment. And I think also just the scale of our downtown, that, you know, trying to create an environment where there can be more independent businesses, which would also include hopefully businesses that are owned by people of color, Black, Indigenous. So, you know, just making Robbinsdale more accessible as we grow. Again, it's not like there was a specific policy in place, but I think just keeping that in mind as we did come up with comprehensive planning.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would be your first action as City Council member to ensure Robbinsdale is starting down the path of working towards racial equity among our residents, businesses, and schools?
Yeah, so one of my other, you know, within the area of focus of, you know, our community connections, a big piece of that is being a proponent for strong community schools, so that make sure that people are considering our community schools as they make decisions and that they don't just blow them off and maybe go somewhere that isn't in Robbinsdale. There's lots of options, whether it's, you know, preschool, it could be Lakeview or Sacred Heart, Robbinsdale Middle School. So just making sure that we're supporting those community schools. And then I think the other big thing is just making sure, again, to be an advocate and build consensus on the city council. So, you know, the way that the city council works, there's 5 people with 4 wards and 1 mayor. And, you know, an individual idea can be great, but if you don't build consensus and everyone else disagrees, then change doesn't happen. So I think one thing that I feel really strongly is just around communication skills and working well with others is to make sure that I'm building a consensus and working closely with my other city council members to make the change that we need to see happen.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, how would you use the Robbinsdale Human Rights Commission as a resource?
Yeah, so again, I mean, my personal experience, I've been on the Planning Commission, and we're just like the Human Rights Commission, we're an advisory committee to the city council. And so I know from the Planning Commission standpoint, there's things, you know, like there were definitely discussions around making Robbinsdale more walkable and bikeable, and what were some ideas, and just having a conversation as a public meeting. The Plan Commission would discuss those things and those ideas up to the city council for, they would make their decision, and then in the end, depending on what it is, gets enacted by our city staff. But I would think that's something that we can do more of, right? Is engage the Human Rights Commission in where we're hearing feedback from the community that, there needs to be something addressed, to work with the Human Rights Commission to get their feedback, or even if it's not someone specifically calling out, using the Human Rights Commission to get a better understanding of what the community feels, because not everyone shares what they think with their city council member.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, another question around RPD. So what changes do you envision for the Robbinsdale Police Department?
So I will say that I've done research specifically around this campaign and running for city council, and I've talked to the police chief and been reading things that are on the website and just other things that have been shared about, the different types of training that are happening. And sort of from my perspective, I feel like they're doing some of the right things around de-escalation and crisis intervention training, implicit bias training. The fact that the state just passed, new laws to say that chokeholds are essentially banned. Well, that was already a policy in Robbinsdale where they don't train on chokeholds, and the warrior training has also been banned at a state level, but Robbinsdale doesn't hire people. I mean, in my conversation with the chief, it's like, you got to be a good person and the right temperament first, and then we can consider you as a police officer. And so it's not to say that there aren't any changes that need to happen. There are, but I think there are a lot of the things that I would think, if I didn't know anything, that I would want to change are being addressed. I guess the one specific thing that I want to bring to our public safety is around mental health. And I think that's something that we can augment our police to have, really have public safety be the right solution for the problem. So if people are having ongoing mental health issues, having the police address it, even though they're trained to be able to handle some of those things, if we had a social worker resource, that would be much more effective. Or if we had mental health resources specifically on our police force, I think that's one area where I would start. And again, I mean, it all kind of comes back to listening to the community and understanding where people feel we need changes.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Now, do you have contacts or community partnerships in Robbinsdale or in other local communities that you would use as resources to advance racial equity?
Yeah, so I've been, through work, I definitely have contacts through our employee resource group, so that's one. But I've also been out and meeting people in the community of Ward 2 and have had conversations with people that have backgrounds in, training people for racial justice and educating people about policy and things like that. And so I would definitely lean on people in our community to help, come up with policy ideas and come up with solutions for how to address areas of, inequity that we have.
Okay, thank you. Now here's a broader question. What is your #1 priority or goal as city council member?
So again, I think it's making sure that the community feels that their voice is heard, those community connections, and building those community connections around Robbinsdale. And then along with that, I think, not to repeat, but also that building consensus piece is really important, right? To make sure that not only am I on the city council representing ideas and having ideas and being a good city council member for my ward, but making sure that I'm getting people to work with me and see my point of view and come to an agreement on solutions.
Okay, thanks. Now we just have maybe 4 more questions that we've prepared for you. So I just want to give a heads up to the audience. If you're thinking on any follow-up questions, that you can start typing them into the chat. But after the next few questions, we'll turn it over to the group for questions there. So when should the City of Robbinsdale take the lead on social issues? And when should the city wait for action at the state or federal levels?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much about waiting to take action. There are some things that are appropriate at the city level, and that if, you know, I mean, anytime we can address something that needs to be addressed at a local level, we should do it. And that's the most immediate way to make change for people that feel that you know, something needs to happen. So it's not so much about waiting. We shouldn't have to wait for state or federal changes, but at the same time, there's some things that, you know, I talked about the pay, you know, the income disparity in the Twin Cities. And in as much as, you know, I don't really know what Robbinsdale could do. That's a Twin Cities problem. People that live in Robbinsdale, most of which don't work in Robbinsdale. I don't know that we can have a huge local impact, but that doesn't mean that we don't do anything and that we don't try to raise voices. And so I guess that's kind of my take on it. It's like we shouldn't wait on anything that we could make a positive impact on. But some things are more appropriate for state, or, I mean, usually it's going to be state, but sometimes maybe federal, but I don't want to wait for that.
Okay, thank you. Next question, what is your vision for ensuring all Robbinsdale residents feel safe and free of harmful prejudices?
Yeah, so again, I think, like, from a community perspective, I do really believe that if we, you know, I mean, I live at 36th and Beard, and I know people, you know, around my community, but there are people like one block over that I don't know as well. And I feel like if I can expand those networks and meet and know more people, and that we can do that in an orchestrated way, that might even be, you know, breaking so we have wards right now, which is a pretty large subset. There's only 4 wards within Robbinsdale. If we could break it into maybe more neighborhood, I mean, we have in North Minneapolis, there's Cleveland and Falwell, and those are, you know, I mean, those are larger areas, but they're neighborhoods that are, you know, that go together. And so there can be a pride in those neighborhoods. And I think, again, that's a way to get people more connected, because, you know, if we try to do an event where we get everyone from Ward 2 together, it's just, that's tough. Or everyone from Robbinsdale, it's like Whiz Bang Days is really our main conduit for doing that. But if we could do things in a smaller way that, you know, maybe it's a handful of blocks. I know we have National Night Out, and we, you know, Robbinsdale does an amazing job of participating in that. But, you know, again, it's like, it's individual blocks. Like, if we could make it bigger, then more people know one another. They feel safer in their neighborhood because they know who's walking around. They feel more connected. And I think that then overflows into public safety, where then we can focus on where are the areas that are emergencies or that need to be addressed specifically, because we're not necessarily, because we, you know, it's not someone who's calling the police when there's not a need to call the police.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. If elected, will you find it important to allocate city funds toward racial equity programs?
So I guess I would want to know, like, what people's ideas are. If Robbinsdale for Racial Justice has ideas on way to use, I mean, I'm totally open to hearing ideas on ways to allocate funds and see if we can have an impact. But I would, again, I think it's not, a lot of our social services are through the county, so it's not like a specific Robbinsdale thing. Again, that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. So it's hearing ideas and finding out what people think we need and what would make that impact. And in those cases, then yeah, let's try to be creative and take action.
Okay, so that can potentially be something we circle back with the group. If people in the audience, if you have follow-up ideas or questions about that, feel free to speak up. But I do have one more prepared question for you. Do you feel that the city parks and recreation serve all residents living in Robbinsdale?
So in a lot of ways, I think that we have great city parks. The one area where I feel like we could do a better job is just as we refresh playgrounds to have playgrounds that are more accessible, that are more inclusive. So I know, for example, in Golden Valley, they built a playground where it's all ramps. Like if any sort of issue, it's still an appropriate play space for, different levels of capacity and ability. And I know, I think we have some of that in Robbinsdale, but we could do a lot better. So I would feel like that would be an area to address. We did get one question on the chat. So I don't know if you see that, but.
I do, yes. I was going to ask that in just a moment.
Okay.
So first I'll just kind of regroup here. So we've now covered the questions that this group has prepared for you. And now we have some time for those here in the meeting to ask any follow-up questions from what you've heard so far. So just as Terry has done, you can type your questions in the chat. You can also, wave at me in the camera, open your camera, and I'll open your microphone. But we've dedicated about 15 minutes of time for this space. And if we do run out of time, I'll ask that you'll hold any remaining questions. And then Mr. Greenberg can tell us in his closing statements the best way to reach out and continue these conversations outside of our meeting today. So yes, Terry has asked, have you ever personally experienced any form of inequity or injustice that might inform your ability to see injustice and influence how you would approach a policy solution?
So that's a great question, and I actually have, and maybe not in the way that you would think, but I'm Jewish. And I have definitely experienced anti-Semitism. It's not necessarily in a visual way that anyone would know that I'm Jewish, but I have definitely, whether in the workplace or just, in common conversation, sometimes it's, people don't realize that I'm Jewish and are saying something that they might feel more comfortable around, their regular group of friends. And it's, it's always uncomfortable to explain that I am Jewish. But making sure that people are aware, like, hey, the things that you say can hurt other people. And so I feel like that does sort of open my mind to taking other people's feelings and perspectives and just experiences into account when it's not always like a pleasant, happy interaction.
Great.
So thank you for that question, Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Any other questions? Again, you can wave, you can just simply open your microphone if you'd like to speak up as well.
I'm gonna ask this question.
Yeah.
So this is a question I've been asking most Ward 2 candidates because there's a common thread with each one of you. And you talk a lot about a lot of community connection. And that is important, and by all means. And you mentioned a connection with Ward 2. So my question is how do you encourage that connection, or how do you engage that connection? What ideas, what events, what kind of creative ways do you engage people that clearly that if we're talking about it, we need more of it, there's something lacking, right? So there's something not working in getting an engagement to begin with. So what creative solutions would you use?
Yeah, I mean, some of them aren't really that creative, but they're needed. Like, for example, I know on my block, we have an email list, and I've wanted to, and I've actually, as I knock on doors around my more immediate neighborhood, I've been asking people to share their email to create, on our block list, it's more about like, we have like cell phone numbers and everything are shared. So it's maybe not so much detail as that, but just to make sure that we're connected, to have email addresses that, if something is going on, you can share it out to the group. I mean, that's everything from suspicious activity in the neighborhood to, hey, there's, somebody's house looks like they, there hasn't been any activity there for a while. Like, is everything okay? Does anybody know someone who lives in that house, right? And just getting the word out to the community. And I think that, again, it's not an email list for all of Robbinsdale. It's not an email list for all of Ward 2. It's, it's just for our neighborhood. And I think, again, kind of getting back to the idea of like, if we had named neighborhoods, that might be something we could include in doing that. One other thing that, that I've done is that I've created my website. Right now, it's mostly around, things around my candidacy, but I would totally envision that being a place where people could come to either have a conversation or at least read what's going on. I mean, I think it's really important. It's not just about going to city council meetings and, not everyone has the time to be engaged at that level. And unfortunately, it's like then you miss out on things that are happening in the city, and it's not always super easy to find information on the website. So, to share that stuff from a place where everybody can just go to jasonforbirdtown.org and it's there, or, whatever, if I maybe come up with a different website that could be, so I guess those are a couple of ideas. I know they're not like earth-shattering, but I do think that's a way. I mean, and I'll throw out one other idea that I have is around just like having more programming and events in our parks that like get people together and hanging out. And that can be everything from involving the police. One idea that I had is around like, we have Live on the Drive in Minneapolis, to do something like that between Sanborn and Lakeview Terrace, where we could have some sort of music event, maybe a couple times a summer. So those are some of the ideas. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
No worries. So just before Nick spoke up, Anne, you were waving. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I actually was going to ask the same question that Nick asked, but I do have a part 2 of it, which is in your role on the Planning Commission, how have you reached out as a commission to the community to get feedback? How have you kind of opened communication, or do you think there's a better way that our commissions could be doing that?
Yeah, you know what, to be perfectly honest, there hasn't been a ton. I mean, so when things come up, there are public hearings and notices go out around that neighborhood around a specific issue. And depending on how excited people are about it or upset, you definitely get different levels of engagement. And so there have been meetings where the entire city hall was full and almost, to overflow capacity. And then most of the meetings, there's like 1 or 2 people with, maybe one neighbor to support what they're doing, or maybe somebody is upset. So, I mean, by its very nature, the Planning Commission, when we have public hearings, there is an announcement that goes out, but we don't have a ton of engagement. And I've been to many city council meetings, and it's definitely more people attend those. But you're right in that, like, we could do a better job of getting people engaged, or, maybe having, special recognition for certain things where it like could get more people just to come for, like bring their neighbors and friends, because there is some sort of recognition or something going on in a positive way for Robbinsdale that could get maybe more people engaged in those meetings.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you for the question.
And your backyard looks really dreamy right now, by the way.
Yeah, right? It's perfect.
Yes. Okay, so Jennifer, thank you for your question in the chat. Jennifer asks, what is your definition of affordable housing? Are you for or opposed to more affordable housing options in Robbinsdale?
So I will just let you know, the Met Council feels that we don't have affordable housing in Robbinsdale. And if you look as far as like median home prices, most of Robbinsdale, just by size and property values, they are pretty affordable relative to the rest of the Twin Cities. And so I think there should be affordable housing. I do think that Robbinsdale has a lot of affordable housing. But if there are underserved communities within Robbinsdale that feel like the reason they need to leave Robbinsdale is because housing is not affordable, then I think that's like something we need to address. But in general, I would say the expectation from like the Metropolitan Council is that we don't have any affordable housing, and I don't agree with that statement either, or maybe not any, but that our percentage is way too low. And I mean, if you just look at home values in Robbinsdale relative to St. Louis Park or Edina or Plymouth, they're much more affordable.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. Lindsay also has a question in the chat. Could you please tell us your thoughts on the city manager position, not the current occupant, but the position itself? Many of us were surprised to learn the level of power the city manager, a non-elected position, holds compared to the mayor and city council. I'm wondering what concerns you might have about setting or pursuing an agenda when the ultimate say, such as hiring the police chief, lies with the manager.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's the structure of a lot of organizations. If you just look at a business, specifically like a publicly traded business, that you've got the CEO who is making the decisions, the board has influence, but isn't necessarily responsible for the specific decision, and yet at the same time has the ability to hire and fire the CEO, right? So, I don't know, in our city, I feel like we've had someone who's been doing a good job, and they do have a lot of power. I guess I don't know like what the other options are or the rules around why it's set up that way. So I think it's an opportunity to learn if that is the structure for Minnesota cities at a state level, then if that needs to change, then we have to look into that more. But I don't know all the rules, so I guess I can't say like what we have to change. I will, like I said, I mean, if we feel like the person in that role is not doing an appropriate job or is doing things in a biased way, then the city council, and if I'm on it, would definitely have the ability to get a new city manager. So it's not like it's totally unchecked power.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Lindsay, for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Also, I wanted to ask Terry. Terry, I noticed you've opened your microphone. Do you have a question?
Oh, well, I actually was going to ask the same question that Jennifer asked.
Oh, okay.
Which was about affordable housing. And if the Met Council is saying that Robbinsdale does not have enough affordable housing, it isn't, I don't think what you said was that we don't have any. It's that according to their metrics, we don't have enough.
Well, I guess I meant that more. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I meant that more in the context of, relative to other cities that are all around us that aren't fully developed, right? We don't have a lot of places to build new housing. So as a city that's fully developed relative to a Plymouth or a Maple Grove, I guess that's where I felt like there was from my perspective, that there was a disconnect, that the expectation is Robbinsdale should do the exact same as what they're doing, when the reality is like we're fully developed and they're not. So again, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that we have the most affordable housing in the Twin Cities. But I do think that there is, as far as like our home values, like they are relatively affordable when you compare them to the rest of the.
I would point to the brand new construction on 81.
Yeah.
There is no way that is affordable housing. And all those multiple units, if we really were committed to providing more affordable housing, in a safe community, mm-hmm. There's a disconnect for me about then why are we building relatively high priced apartments and condos?
Yeah, I mean,
in space.
yeah, so, yeah, I mean, there are developers that are building it. Obviously, the city is involved. I do believe there are portions of those units that are affordable and were designed as such. But at the same time, it is market rate housing that is being filled. So I think I would say if that was built in Robbinsdale and sat vacant, then we have a lot to learn. But the reality is that those apartments, if they weren't affordable, then we wouldn't have occupancy. And I feel like Birdtown Flats is pretty successful, but I do know that some of those units were designed, I think, to take into account affordable housing. I don't know if they're like specifically like under the government mandated umbrella of affordable housing, but they're like studios and you know, I don't know what else they call them, but like a 1-bedroom, everything's all in one room, where they were designed with affordable housing in mind. But I hear what you're saying. I mean,
Thank you. Thanks, Terry. Jennifer, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just have, can you hear me?
Yep.
I can.
I have one follow up to that. So when you were talking earlier, you were talking about the median income of a Black family versus a white family, and how the median income for a Black family is around $40,000 versus $80,000 for a white family. I feel like Robbinsdale is super affordable for white people, but when you look at Black families and what their income is, I don't feel like Robbinsdale is affordable for Black people. And when you think about affordable, one definition of affordable would be your rent or your mortgage being 30% or less of your income. And most people in the Twin Cities who are renters do not pay 30% or less. They pay up to oftentimes 50% or more. So yes, they are paying rent, but it's cost burdening their household, and they are very close to being evicted at any time. So I just feel like as a city that says we want to be welcoming and anti-racist, like we need to acknowledge that a lot of our perspective is from a white middle class perspective, and not from the perspective of folks who live in North Minneapolis right next door, or in other parts of the city, or who are getting pushed way out into the suburbs because that's the only place that they can afford, and where they don't have access to public transit and they don't have a good way to get to work. So I just feel like we really need to be thinking outside of our perspective when we're talking about what affordable housing is.
yeah.
And I do think the city council has done a terrible job of attempting to even tackle that. And some of the organizers that I've talked to who are working in Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park, when they've approached the council, they've just been shut down. Like that's not even a conversation that the council was willing to have. And I just find that super problematic. So I just
Wait, you're saying in Brooklyn Park, they're saying that about Robbinsdale, or that's happening in Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center as well?
So there's organizers who are doing a lot of work around housing in Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center. And when they approach the Robbinsdale City Council to try to have a conversation, that's just not even on the table.
Okay, sure.
It's like affordable housing equals people that we don't want in our community, AKA poor people or Black people or whoever. And that's just, I feel like that's a very troubling perspective. And I have talked to other people who have said the mayor has said something pretty much the same thing, even though he wasn't knowing the perspective of the person he was talking to. He felt comfortable enough to say that we don't want affordable housing here because we don't like the element that it brings. And so I just think we need to really be cognizant of what that means when our elected officials are willing to just say that to whoever they, have a conversation with when the idea of affordable housing comes up. Because right now there's naturally occurring affordable housing in Robbinsdale, but there's no actual targeted affordable housing to make this community reachable, basically, to a lot of the population in the Twin Cities that really needs to live either in the city or very close to the city for various reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I totally appreciate that perspective, and I feel like you have expertise in it. So if I'm on the city council, I'd love to hear more ideas on how Robbinsdale and our resources that we can help get those voices heard and have action on that, so that you feel like something is being done, because shutting down the voices to say like, we're not going to even hear this is not an appropriate response. That I don't know what we can do as a city from a city government perspective, but if there are ways we can impact that to make it more beneficial for our residents or for just communities in general, then I think we should be open to hearing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if there are no other questions at this time, I think we will bring our meeting to a close and ask Mr. Greenberg for a brief closing statement. And Jason, could you also tell us the best way to find you online and the best way to continue these conversations outside of this meeting?
Yeah. So thanks everyone for hosting me and having me as part of this conversation. And really, I mean, again, it's like, just as much as it's about me saying my ideas, I think more important, I want to hear from the community and from your community about what's going on in Robbinsdale and what those experiences are that, again, that maybe I'm not hearing or not seeing. And so I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity. As far as getting in touch with me, my website is jasonforbirdtown.org. It has my phone number, it has my email address. Again, I definitely want to be accessible. And I also recognize, I've been on the Planning Commission. I know not all these conversations are easy, and they don't always have everyone, like a winning outcome for everyone, but we need to be honest and open about the conversation and what we're trying to do. And if I'm on the city council, providing that feedback to the community.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for attending. Lindsay also says in the chat, Jason, thank you for answering our questions. I second that. Thank you so much, Mr. Greenberg, for your time with us today. So just a reminder, everyone, be sure you're registered to vote. Vote early by mail, and be sure your ballot is postmarked by August 11th. And if you vote in person on the 11th, please wear your mask and practice social distancing. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And if anybody sees me out and about, please stop and say hello. You can just call me Jason. You don't have to call me Mr. Greenberg.
Okay, we'll do Jason.
But yeah, I'm totally open to talking and hearing as many viewpoints and having discussions as I can.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jason.
Bye, thanks.